hoping the mic's working. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Tricia-Marwick. I'm the Presiding Officer of the Scottish Parliament, and I'm delighted to be the chair for this morning's event, which will discuss and debate the life and contribution of William-Wallace. Joining me for this morning's discussion, Professor-Michael-Prestwich, who specialises in the history of 13th and 14th century England, Dr. Alexander Grant, Reader of Medieval British History at Lancaster University, Dr. David Ditchburn, Senior Lecturer in Medieval History at Trinity College Dublin, and Fiona-Watson, who is an independent researcher and an Honorary Research Fellow in History at the University of Dundee. There will be an opportunity for members of the audience to put questions and views to the panel later on in the session. However, if I might start about how close we can get to Wallace and others of his time as people, given the lack of documents which record their thoughts, of very, very few early Scottish chronicles to give contemporary impressions of Wallace or of other Scots. So what I thought I would do is I would ask each of the panel to talk for a couple of minutes about Wallace, the man, and his importance both in terms of Scotland and Europe, and then we'll pick up on all these questions as we go through. Would you like to start? A couple of minutes?
Okay. I think to turn from the Scottish sources are one thing, but I'll talk from an English perspective on this as to what the English view of Wallace was. Because there's no difficulty, I think, in knowing what the English thought of Wallace, which is they regarded him as lowborn, as an archer, which is interesting because his seal shows a bow and arrow. So there's clearly some truth behind this. Wallace was hated. He was a bogeyman as far as the English were concerned. The situation, the background, I think, is important. That what the English were really concerned about was the French War, which began in 1294. And the whole thing was upset in terms of the plans for a campaign in France by the Scottish rebellion. Come 1297, Edward I was determined on conducting a campaign in Flanders, come what may. And it's at that stage, of course, that Wallace appears. And this Wallace's role, I think, is in part, it's a popular rebellion that he leads against English policies in Scotland, against the fear that Edward I is going to do in Scotland what he did in England, which is to raise enormous sums of money, recruit large numbers of men, seize people's goods in the interest of his war. This was something that Scotland had not experienced. And Wallace, I think, represented to the English something really very, very dangerous, that it wasn't only a Scottish rising, it was also a popular rising. And when you then get his great success, of course, at Stirling Bridge, followed in the autumn 1297 by a terrifying raid into northern England with all sorts of atrocities alleged, then I think you can see what the English view of Wallace would be, that he's a brigand, he's a thug, he's of low birth, and he is absolutely hated. And he is, of course, a remarkable figure in that he was consistently loyal to the Scottish cause. He never came to terms with the English, in contradiction, of course, to so many of those involved in the wars of independence at that time. But I think that's my couple of minutes.
Okay. Alexander?
Yeah, on Wallace, okay. First of all, I come from the Black Isle in the north. So I sympathise with Andrew Murray, that's more than Wallace, who's actually buried there, of course. And I suspect Andrew Murray gets written out of history rather too much. As for Wallace, as Michael said, a brigand, the first reference to him in documents is almost certainly William Wallace, thief, a gang leader who stole a beer from a pub in Perth. Though admittedly the English army was at Stirling, so it might be requisitioning for his back. I don't know, but this is the point about Wallace. He is very, very minor landholding family, technically noble, but not really. The point is about Wallace's emergence is that after the English victories and takeover in 1296, all the major Scottish leaders are removed by Edward I. There's a big power vacuum. And then spontaneous rebellions emerge, both with Wallace and with Mary and so on. They are victorious at Stirling Bridge. They hijack the Scottish, in effect, they hijack it. In a way, Wallace strikes me, if he'd been more successful and lived longer, survived longer, as somebody like Lech Wałęsa. In Scottish terms, you could think of him maybe like Jimmy Reid. I think a non-political operation that then gets more and more important, parallel to the formal politics. For my own purposes, because I've been looking at the Wallace letter, my interest later on is how he's used in France. Michael talked about the Anglo-French War. The war is between England and France, remember. Scotland, in a way, is, in global things, Scotland is more secondary to that. It's Edward against the French. And the French, I think, will want to use they use their support for the Scots cause always to threaten Edward. The English are scared that the French army the English think that the French might send troops to help the Scots, or indeed if Wallace is in France, I think what the French will simply do is always threaten to overrun Gascony, which is what the war started off about. And every time they do that, Edward has to back down and kind of make a peace, or make a truce, at least, an armistice, in which the Scots are included. And I think Wallace is part of that, almost as an extra figurehead or threat or puppet. We've got Wallace on our side, that's an extra threat. He's, in that respect, a kind of pawn in a bigger diplomatic game, but he's only a pawn because he's important in the first place, I think is how I put it.
David.
Well, when we talk about great national heroes, I suppose our focus tends to be on national history, tends to be on political history, and I think to try and maximise what we know about Wallace, and to some extent anyway, deal with this problem of the limited sources, one way to address this is to try and look at the bigger picture, try and look at the milieu from which Wallace comes, from the economic, the social, the cultural milieu from which he comes. Now, we know very little about where he does come from. Is it Ayrshire or is it Renfrewshire or wherever? We don't know a great deal about his social background, but as you said, he's not from the lowest class in society, the great mass of the peasantry. Wallace isn't a townsman, and that almost certainly means that Wallace knows something about the land. Wallace knows something about agriculture and about how the economy works. And I think we can see that in the way that he kind of wages warfare. It's admittedly a much later source, but writing in the 15th century, Albert Bower tells us that when he moved his army into England in 1297, he waited until after the crops had been harvested to do that. He then kept his army in northern England. Why? Because food was in short supply in Scotland. What did his army do when they were in northern England? Well, one thing that they went around doing was hacking down fruit trees. I mean, this is economic warfare with a very particular understanding, I think, of the agricultural world in which these people are actually living. But of course, if you know something about the land in Scotland, where people make their money from in late 13th century Scotland is wool. And as Sandy said elsewhere, I mean, wool is the equivalent of oil to the modern economy. It's wool that the Scots make their money from by selling it abroad. And that takes us maybe to the Lübeck letter. What is the interest of Lübeck and Hamburg in all of this? It's wool. It's not, I think, wool in Lübeck and Hamburg. Nobody is remotely interested in wool in Lübeck or Hamburg. But the important thing about these towns is that they provide the ships which take the wool to the Low Countries, to Bruges, and to the great textile-producing towns of the Low Countries. So there's a European angle there that we have to consider. And just to maybe finish off before passing on to Fiona here, let's remember, I mean, if we accept the conventional dates that Wallace disappeared in 1299 off to Europe, didn't maybe come back till 1303, that's about 4 years of his active political life. That's almost half of his active political life that he's actually in continental, or could well be, in continental Europe. And I suppose one of the big questions is, what's he actually doing there?
Before we get on to the answers to that, Fiona,
I wish we
unless you know.
No, not really. But I just wanted to sort of finish by sort of saying why I like William Wallace. And I like William Wallace because by looking at him, and also sometimes if you look at women in this period, which people rarely do, you see people doing what they're not supposed to do, and I quite like that. In that studying Wallace sort of lifts the lid on people below the level of the top nobility, whose life and works we can trace something of, given, as we've already said, the scarcity of documents for this period. Wallace, as we've already said, is not of the top nobility. He's someone whose name we should never really have known except if he was a miscreant or did something he wasn't supposed to do. But here we have someone who came from a lowly background and became Guardian of Scotland, led Scottish armies, and went on diplomatic missions to Europe on behalf of the King John Balliol. So, as someone has already mentioned, when Edward I comes in 1296, he takes away the top layer of the Scottish political classes. The nobility are in English prison. And that, you would have thought, would leave a vacuum. There's no king anymore. John Balliol's in prison too. But no, the middling sort, not the middle classes exactly, but the people below the level of the high nobility, are clearly quite capable of organising themselves throughout the country. They don't need someone at the top to tell them that they object to being taxed and put upon by the new English regime. I actually do happen to believe that if Edward I had been more tactful with these people in particular when he invaded in 1296, in other words, said to them, okay, I am going to tax you much harder because that's what we do in England, I've got a lot of wars to fight, but in return you'll get extremely good justice. I think that people might have found that acceptable. That's very controversial, and we can no doubt have words about that later. But he didn't. He took from the Scots, and he didn't give them good justice. In fact, I think it was highly likely that Edward's officials were not behaving very well at all. But anyway, these middling sort were the people who took it upon themselves, like Wallace, not just, because I think the important point is in 1297 there were revolts all across the country. Wallace was one of the best known, and he wasn't even on his own then. And they did that. And subsequent to that, even when the Scottish nobility did come back and technically lead the rebellion, then you do find these people still organising themselves. And in fact, Edward I understood the importance of these people, because by about 1300, 1301, he was saying to his officials in Scotland, do not accept to your peace the high nobility. Try and win the people underneath, because it's them that have to fight in the Scottish armies, it's them that have to pay some money at least towards upkeeping the Scottish government, and if you can get them on our side, win them over, then effectively the rebellion is over. And it's very unusual in this period to be actually to get a good look at how important these are. So Wallace, although he's vitally important and is the most exceptional of all these people, nonetheless represents a much wider constituency. And just on the, we're not really meant to be talking about women, but when Wallace is described as the thief, it's actually a lady brewer in Perth who's having her beer nicked. And I always like, just along the road in Linlithgow, there's a lady who's an engineer, and she's objecting to the English officials in Linlithgow Castle who've nicked her plumb line. So like Wallace, this period, the small glimpses of people whom we should never have heard of, and I think that's absolutely wonderful.
Okay, well, thank you for the opening remarks. I know that most people here will also have seen our exhibition of the two letters, the only two documents that are directly associated with Wallace himself. So I want to spend just a couple of minutes on the letters themselves before we go further. One of the letters, of course, is the Lubeck letter, which has been preserved and treasured by Lubeck itself, and they very kindly allowed us to borrow it. We've talked about the wool trade in Lubeck. Do you think, as well as the Lubeck letter, that Wallace would have been writing to other countries, the Low Countries, other towns and cities? And is it highly probable that, you know, there are more letters that have been written? Was there a particular significance of Lubeck and Hamburg, or do you think that this was one of a number of letters that Wallace was writing, essentially saying, you know, despite everything else that's happened, Scotland's open for business?
I mean, there may have been other letters elsewhere. If there were, my guess is that it would probably be in the Baltic direction in particular that one should look. I mean, I think what's happened, I mean, there's a bit of speculation in all of this, but when Edward I has commenced the assault on Scotland, Berwick has been at the focal point of the attack. And the attack on Berwick comes not just from land, but from the seaside as well. And there are a whole lot of vessels that are caught up in that action. Now, we know that some of those vessels came from the Baltic town of Stralsund. And those ships were destroyed. They got no compensation for that. They tried to get compensation and failed to do so. And if you're a businessman and you're sending your ships into a port and they're attacked and you're not getting any compensation, you're going to take fright. So I think what's probably happened is that the Hanseatic merchants, the merchants from the Baltic towns who have traditionally visited Berwick and taken all of those wool exports, not back to the Baltic but to the Low Countries, they have taken fright. And that causes a major problem. How do you get your wool to the continent? In other words, how do you get your money? How do you get the money that you may well want to be spending on arms supplies at this particular period? So they've got to kind of try and reactivate this trade, and I think this is an appeal to bring back the ships, basically.
Great. I think one thing that David mentioned is these are Hanseatic towns. And I think that's probably quite an important element to this, that you could contact these towns that were effectively independent, that had got a mercantile organisation, an effective organisation of merchants that didn't really exist anywhere else. That if you're going to contact Flanders, you could try and contact the urban authorities of the Flemish cities, but they were under fairly heavy English influence in any case. The obvious thing in Flanders would be contact the Count of Flanders. Wouldn't have the same degree of influence as writing to Lübeck and Hamburg, to the Hanseatic cities. So I think there's something going on there that you wouldn't have got. You wouldn't have had letters sent to Bruges, Ghent, or elsewhere in the same way. What we don't know, of course, is what the proportion of trade in Scotland handled by German merchants as against others was, but I suspect it's very high. Certainly in the ports of eastern England at this period, Hull, for example, has a very heavy German presence, and I would think the further north you go, the heavier the German presence is. These were the really important merchants.
One quick thing that David would have said is that Berwick, of course, we're sitting in Edinburgh. But Berwick is the biggest town. Berwick, Edinburgh and Leith only emerge after Berwick disappears, after Berwick's taken by the English. Berwick is the main port for Scotland, and damaging Berwick obviously is important. And my students reckon I'm obsessed with wool, or sheep, and wool is vitally important. England is a major exporter to the European looms, to the main textile industries of Flanders, or the Low Countries. Scotland produces about 15% more. It's about 15% of England's. And which is a heck of a lot. It's still probably the second biggest exporter. And the Flemish, I think, are desperate to keep that because you don't want the English to have a complete monopoly, a complete stranglehold. If you get sometimes aroused, the wool is cut off. Another point I sometimes make, if you're Welsh and you've got sheep there and you want to export your wool, you will export your wool via England. To get money from Welsh wool, you actually have to do it through England. So the wool there is pushing Welsh into accepting the English. The Flemings, the Scots want independence of the English, they're in competition. That wool is a strong vested interest, an economic interest for Scottish independence. It works in different ways in different parts of the British Isles.
And I think just to push on from that, about back on to Berwick again, I think that Berwick is a major objective for Edward I. He pays a lot of attention to it. He wants it safe. He encourages English burgesses to come and settle there. And although he gets diverted, it is vitally important to him, partly maybe because, as you say, he wants to have the entire UK supply of wool. Also, his own coffers are running down because of the wars that he fights. But I think there's another irony about the wool in that although this is not it's hard to gauge it. I think there is circumstantial evidence to show that it's not just the big abbeys in the borders who have the huge wool sheep flocks. You don't have wool flocks. It's probably almost everybody can have a few sheep and are making money in Scotland. Scotland is developing economically in the 13th century. It's not developing militarily. It's really not bothered about that. It's a relatively peaceful place, certainly in the second half. And that's a big irony. But that encourages a lot of people in Scotland to invest in land in England. I think we haven't really studied it in depth, but there's a huge number of Scots in England buying up pieces of land, even quite not far down the social scale, but relatively far down the social scale. And I don't think we've quite understood just how intertwined the two countries, well, I think we know that, but just the extent to which the Scots are in England and how difficult, therefore, that will make the war when it eventually breaks out in 1296.
Quickly on Fiona's point, in England, I think it can be shown that only the great nobles, or the nobles and the abbeys, possess about no more than 10, I think 5% of the sheep. The rest of it is ordinary people. And I tried to do that for Scotland. It's not dissimilar if you calculate it up. There's millions of sheep, and you can't actually, when you look at the
They're
flocks...
smaller than they are now, Michael.
You look at the flocks, you can't get them all. It is the ordinary people's. It is. And your point about the pressure of taxation, of taking the wool, of course, Edward I does that in England as well, and just about causes rebellion there as well, doesn't he?
Yes.
You've got to. It wasn't that.
Stirling Bridge that stopped it, wasn't it, Michael?
Yeah, but the point there is that just taking everything causes total rebellion in Scotland and almost in England. That's Michael's stuff. There was a big political crisis.
Well, that's getting on to a slightly different story. I mean, I think one point I would make about Wallace is actually he did Edward I a good service in that the king in 1297, in the autumn of 1297, Edward I was in Flanders, facing considerable difficulty. His army was much too small, but determined to continue the war. And then the news came of the defeat at Stirling Bridge, and that, in a sense, I think brought him to his senses, and he realised he had to get a truce quickly in France, come back to England, where again it had brought the opposition to their senses, and they realised something really dangerous was going on in Scotland. What looked like in August a really serious situation of rebellion, by November everyone had decided, no, this is okay, and we'll pull together and we'll deal with Scotland.
If I could turn to the safe passage letter from King Philip IV, I mean, we could talk perhaps a bit about the letter itself, because it's been examined quite closely over the last few years. If we could maybe just talk about the authenticity of the letter and how it was authenticated and how important it is. But secondly, we could maybe go on, you know, what would be in it for King Philip of France to write such a letter for Wallace to make sure that, you know, everybody gave him safe passage and like. Yeah.
Fiona and I have been involved with that. So
there you go.
First of all, of course, it's a very routine little letter. It's not a hugely important one. It's maybe survived because it isn't important. I think we took a bit of certain English historians took a bit of persuasion. We think it's 99.9% certain that it was our William Wallace that is mentioned. We don't actually know that for definite, but we can very, very comfortably sure about that. But it is, remember, it's a letter from the King of, it's simply instructions from the King of France to his agents in the Curia. It is dated, technically it follows the form of what they call letters close. These are private, you have two sets of royal commands, one a private sealed for your eyes only, so to speak, just for an individual, do this. The other one is telling people I've appointed somebody, so it's more a public one. Those are letters patent, letters open. I'm not oversimplifying too much, I'm worried for Michael. But this one has got the technical forms of a letter close. For example, there's no date on it. It's just given by the king at Pierrefonds on this date. Incidentally, if any of you watch Merlin on BBC TV, The castle there that they use is Pierrefonds. It's had a big facelift about 100 years later, but that's the castle that this letter was issued from, which is one thing you might remember. But
it really did not look like
but
that.
it doesn't look like that. It's a huge big, I know it's a huge big facelift afterwards in about 1400. Pity, but it is the place there. Anyway, the letter itself, therefore, should be a letter close, which means that the letter, little piece, if you look at it, what you do with letters close is you write them, you then fold it up, you cut a little strip along the bottom, and if you look carefully at that letter, you'll see the bottom left-hand corner, it goes slightly, that's where that tag has been cut off, been pulled off. It's being pulled, actually, it's frayed there, it doesn't cut, the rest of it's cut. So you fold it up, tie the tag, that little strip, round it, and stick a steel in the whole lot to keep it together. So when the seal is then broken, it's handed over to the recipient. He opens it, uses it, and keeps it. So it could be said, therefore, that if it was actually used by Wallace in Rome, then it would have stayed in Rome, it would have stayed with the French, and if it was in his possession, it means he hasn't got to Rome. However, and this is where the technicalities get annoying, the National Records, National Archives of England, the PRO people, did very technical, extensive tests on it. One of the latest things they said, it was never sealed. There's not a slightest trace of sealing wax on the back of the letter. So it wasn't sealed close, as it should have been. It's almost certainly sealed open, i.e. two tags are cut and the seal dangles from it, which means it can be reused, which means that it can be used it can be used and kept with Wallace for using again, which makes sense if you're going to various people. It is very anomalous. It isn't written the way it should be, but it's sealed the way it should be. So it's a slightly awkward document. But I think we did think for a while, if it's in Wallace's possession, it means he never used it in Rome. I don't think that can be argued now. I think it's perfectly possible he does go to Rome. We don't know, but we can't say that the letter shows it doesn't, if you see what I mean. Why? Yes, Fiona?
Fiona,
I think
about the letter, and then we'll maybe talk a wee bit about Philip.
Yeah.
I know a lot of you went to Amanda's talk earlier, but just to sort of reiterate what was going on at that point in time, Wallace leaves Scotland in the autumn of 1299. So it's over a year after the Battle of Falkirk, which he lost. He's no longer Guardian. But he goes as head of a small embassy of about 5, 6 people. He's clearly the head of that embassy. To the court of Philip of France. Now, the Scots have a big presence in France, has already been said. We know that the Bishop of Dunkeld, Matthew Cranbeth, is permanently resident in Paris. He's been given about £100 a year by the French king. And clearly he's also busying around trying to get support for the Scottish cause in the courts of Europe. William Lamberton, the Bishop of St Andrews, goes out there on embassies and also to Rome. So there's a big diplomatic push. We sometimes forget about this angle when we concentrate on battles and what's going on in Scotland itself. But there's a huge diplomatic push. King John Balliol has been released into papal custody in the summer of 1299, which explains exactly why Wallace leaves Scotland in the autumn. The two things are vitally connected because Wallace wants to lobby very hard to make sure that King John Balliol can come back to Scotland as soon as possible. But what they need is for the Pope to be the one who makes that decision. He has to sit down with the arguments from the Scots and, of course, the counter-arguments from the English and decide whether the English king does indeed have any rights over Scotland, whether he was right to depose King John, or whether King John is actually still the monarch of Scotland and should be returned home. So that embassy is part of a big diplomatic push. But it shows how closely Wallace was associated with Balliol. He's going almost certainly to speak with Balliol if he possibly can. And there's a lot of activity happening there. And I just want to say one other thing about this letter. What was the words that we agreed at the end with everybody? It is more likely that the letter was with Wallace when he was captured in 1305. And there was a whole load of letters, safe conducts in particular, that he had on his possession. Now, I don't know about you, but if I was on the run and people were, my own people and the English were after me, having my archive with me might not be the first thing I think about. And I suspect that what Wallace is trying to do is get away out of Scotland, and that he needs all these safe conducts, including ones that are not dated, that are still valid technically. Whether it's to forward King John's, continue to argue the case in the courts of Europe. So I think there's two parts to that story. There's the original bit when Wallace was on his embassy, and then what he was trying to do.
Where she captured, is your point, isn't it?
It does say on the back of the letter, doesn't it, that it's the fourth letter to the King of France. So clearly this is a rare survival, but there were a whole lot of letters, that at least four that Wallace had got.
Two things. I mean, one of those letters, I think, relates to Norway, doesn't it?
Yes,
and
it does.
it is certainly not inconceivable that Wallace might have gone there. There are various reasons for that. Let's remember, of course, at the time that Orkney is part of the Norwegian kingdom. Let's remember too that there is an issue of outlaws between the two kingdoms in Orkney, which is dealt with by later treaties. So that's not impossible that he went in that direction. Rome, I mean, this thing about diplomacy, there are more seasoned diplomats around than Wallace, though. I see Wallace as somebody who might be the figurehead of a diplomatic mission rather than as the person who's actually doing the nuts and bolts of the negotiations. But there is another very good reason why Wallace would go to Rome in 1300. And that is, it's the Jubilee. It's the first papal Jubilee. Everybody's going to Rome in 1300. This is like the Olympics of 1300. Everybody is heading to Rome. That we know from chronicle accounts there are massive crowds of people in Rome. We know that the Abbot of York is there and gets his leg crushed in the stampedes of the crowds and dies afterwards. And this is why I said earlier, we shouldn't, I think, forget the kind of the cultural milieu from which Wallace comes from. There is no contradiction, I think, between a man who is a political leader, a military leader, and somebody who can also have a deep religious faith, as everybody in the Middle Ages does, and who might well want to go to Rome, as everybody else does, to seek absolution.
And Philip, what was in it for him?
Can I say a word about Philip, who is a complex and devious character, I think, who certainly, going back to 1294 when the Anglo-French War started, engaged in some very questionable diplomacy, where he deluded the English into thinking, if you hand Gascony over to the French, we'll just keep it for 40 days and give it you back again. And of course, he did nothing of the sort. The English handed over their fortresses in Gascony. The French king rubbed his hands together. He'd got them now, and he certainly wasn't going to give them back. And the English were completely deluded and deceived. And I think at this period, in 1299, he's almost certainly playing again a double game. Because one thing that happens in 1299, even though the two countries are formally only at truce, they're still technically war rather than peace. But the marriage takes place between the French king's sister Margaret and Edward I. So that looks like Edward would have thought, well, that's fine. We're now getting we're getting a French alliance. There's no problem. But at the same time, Philip is clearly negotiating. There's Scots present at his court. There's Wallace comes, and I think he's still concerned to stir up trouble in Scotland. What happens by 1302, and this is important, that one of Philip's great concerns was in the north, in Flanders, and the great French army was defeated at the Battle of Courtrai in 1302, and that absolutely transformed the situation. And in a sense, a very dubious deal was struck between Edward and Philip in 1302, whereby the French king said, OK, I'll abandon any support for the Scots, providing you abandon any support for the Flemings. And Edward was quite happy with this, and that simply transformed the whole political situation. From 1302, the Scots could no longer rely on Philip. But up to that stage, Philip, I think, was very happy to indicate to the Scots, yes, he's prepared to support them, to back them as far as he could, while deceiving, as it were, the English by saying, yes, OK, marry my sister, that's fine.
Yeah, we often think And the popular consciousness is probably Falkirk, great English victory, Wallace is defeated, all downhill for the Scots after that. But no, it's Fiona's work, this isn't it? English actually get back out. They only have a small foothold in Scotland. They don't make anything out of the Falkirk. They don't really, there's campaigning a bit, but not much, because there's always the pressure from the French. If you do that, the implied threat is, we won't make a truce, we will take over Gascony. The English don't do anything in Scotland until 1302. And 1302, then, when the French are out of the war, then the English move in. But 1298 to 1302 is a very different phase, and the Scots are holding their own in that. But then, they're led, after Falkirk, they're in effect led by John Cumming. And John Cumming's one of my interests. And I tried to say a bit of that at the end of Amanda's talk. The Cummings are the people who run Scotland. Balliol probably, and Balliol's really connected with them, and they in effect put him on the throne. They will see themselves, I think, they will almost certainly see Balliol as their puppet. Whether Balliol is behaving like that, that's, I think, the way they see it. So you've got three waves problems. You've got the famous Balliol versus Bruce idea. You've also got Balliol, I suspect, and other Scots who want the rightful king, who is Balliol, but don't want the Cummins. There's an it splits within the parties, if you see what I mean, which in this place you'll understand. And you can see, one thing, remember, the big quarrel that when we know about the row about Wallace going to France, Malcolm Wallace is in the retinue of Robert Bruce. If anything, Wallace is close, and Wallace's younger brother, John, who we don't know much about, is captured by the English in 1306, having been fighting for Bruce, and is then executed. It's a younger brother of Wallace, another brother of Wallace. Unless they're the same in the names, it got confused. But there's a Wallace brother, according to the English documents, who was executed fighting for Robert Bruce in 1306. Now, I'm not saying that Wallace is not wanting to get Balliol back, to work for Balliol. He's working for the proper king, if you see what I mean. But once Balliol is freed, they change the guardianships, not Wallace, which I suspect Wallace might have wanted, but they appoint John Soules over the head of the Cummings. Cumming doesn't like that. Cumming is actually Balliol's nephew. If Balliol's out of it, he's the heir to the throne. Much better claim than Robert Bruce. I think a lot of this is actually the other Scottish politicians wanting not to be dominated by the Cummins. And I think there's a Cumming embassy. I think Wallace is trying to kind of balance that with the French. Is more complicated. But also, as Michael has said, the very fact that Wallace is in France, when he goes to France, it's at about the time of the Edward I's marriage to Philip's daughter. Wallace, according to one English chronicler, is arrested, and the English want to get hold of him by the French. But I suspect that's diplomatic, because he then finishes up in Paris and is given, over that year, 4,000 livres tourne, about £500 sterling, which is a lot of money. Balliol's estates in England, the big estates he has in England, were worth £1,000. Wallace is given half of that by the French king. That year, the records, then there's a gap in the records. There might be more. This, again, is what Fiona found out. So there's a lot of French he's made quite a fuss of. I suspect that was sorted out by Lamberton and Philip beforehand. But he's there, surely as a very obvious Scottish leader in France, who will therefore be advising the French on military things and how to help. One of his entourage is eventually captured by the English, spying on the fortress of Blaye, which is just beside Bordeaux. Scots with Wallace snooping around Gascony, French threat to Gascony. Whenever the English attack Scotland, the French threaten Gascony. And I think it's all part of that image I think you've got. Then there's the big truce that's made in 1300, and it's about a week later that letter's signed. And Wallace can then either go off to Rome, or he's going off for other things. But his first thing, I think, is to be just a public figure showing England's public enemy number one in France with the French. It's the French being very French and being very devious, but benefiting very much from that. I think. And the Scots benefit as well, because it stops the English pressure.
David, Fiona, want to contribute anything to Philip? No? Let me put this on to you, Fiona, first. Given that there is so little that we actually know about Wallace the man, we've only got 2 documents associated with them, very, very little written down. How is it that somebody like Wallace can endure through all these centuries and is as important to Scotland now as perhaps he was then. I mean, how many other historical figures do we have where there is just so little information? Well, what's the reason? I mean, you know, people haven't just suddenly discovered Wallace the Braveheart. I mean, you know, the Wallace Monument was, you know, put up by public subscription. So, you know, the hero that is Wallace is very, very deeply rooted into the Scottish psyche. What's your thoughts?
Well, in a way, I would quite like you to ask the audience that question.
I'm coming to them.
I'm sure you will.
I'm coming to them. This is to open it up for them now.
Definitely. But in a way, I deal with the real Wallace, and the real Wallace is not the Wallace that is dear to our hearts. But the reason why Wallace, the road to the Wallace Monument and Braveheart and where we are today is really from the 1470s when Blind Harry wrote his great poem. It was quite common in the Middle Ages for big romances to be made about national heroes. There may have been other ones that we've lost along the way. But the one written about Wallace was written for a particular political purpose, namely that the Scottish King James III was contemplating, God forbid, to making a peace with England. And there were a lot of Scottish nobles, particularly in the borders, who had a vested interest in war with England as they sort of raided over both sides. I mean, both sets of nobles did this. And the last thing they wanted was a peace that would stop all that. So they commissioned somebody, well, Blind Harry, we presume, to write this great epic poem about the man who, as I think Michael said earlier, was the one you could point to who never did submit to Edward I. To be honest, he tried, but he was given such bad conditions that he decided not to. He was the only one in 1304 who was told that he had to come grovelling before the English king, who wouldn't guarantee that he wouldn't execute him on the spot, unlike everyone else who got their life and limb. So he decided, funnily enough, that he wouldn't do that. But going back to the 1470s, Harry writes this incredible poem, almost certainly, well, certainly mixing in lots and lots of different stories from the Wars of Independence. I mean, Wallace couldn't have been, like Mary Queen of Scots, he couldn't have spent one night in the same bed. You know, he was absolutely everywhere at the same time. It doesn't tally with what we know of the Wars of Independence, but it's almost certainly local stories about what did happen, but to other people. So he's kind of superhero from the 1470s onwards, and it is incredible the extent to which Braveheart is Blind Harry. Okay, he didn't sleep with the Princess of Wales, but in Harry it's actually Margaret who married the French princess who married Edward I. So that's already in there. So there is that, but I think Wallace is the kind of person, because we know so little, you can put what you like onto him. He can be who you want him to be, because there's very little to contradict it. And that's great. Every nation needs a hero like Wallace, and I have no problem with it. To have somebody to aspire to, if it's positive virtues, there is nothing wrong with that. We've Robin Hood, we have William Tell, we've got all these bits. Sandy might disagree. But I think that every nation has these heroes. They don't exist in real life, but hey, that's the point about them. It's something that we should aspire to.
Remember the first ballad, earliest ballad reference to Wallace, or the earliest spin. Wallace is spun all the time, right from his own lifetime. But one of them is the Comet and Winton's. That's the killing in Lanark, and that's from a ballad, because it's a different stanza from Winton, who's written a verse chronicle, but he changes. He's quoting a ballad. In it, though, Wallace, what does Wallace do? He's dressed in green. He goes off back into the forest, he gives his gang, and he kills sheriffs.
You rest your case.
Wallace, you could say Wallace is like Robin Hood, but the best work on Robin Hood now says, no, it's the Scottish writers who developed the Robin Hood thing on the basis of Wallace, that Wallace is actually a model for Robin Hood, not Robin Hood as a model for the way Wallace is emerged. It's the two things are absolutely intertwined, and Wallace and Robin Hood get together and produce William Tell. Who's doing exactly the same thing.
Not even going there.
If you see what I mean. We like these heroes, and Wallace becomes very much the kid here, the mythical hero like that. But that's going on in his own lifetime, just about. The spin goes right the way back before Blind Harry, because they're arguing over Wallace. One quick point, I'll just check this from Michael. Edward I is always known as the Hammer of the Scots. the biggest expert in Edward I said that's a much, much later term, Malleus Scotorum. Walter Bower in the 1440s is describing Wallace as the Malleus Anglorum, the hammer of the English.
Oh, Wallace is.
Wallace is.
Yes, okay.
Is describing Wallace as the hammer of the English. Not sure if it's an earlier one, but that's the one concept. But he comes in the 1470s to the Douglases and the Bruces, and particularly the Douglases hijack the story of Scottish independence. And the Douglases have now gone by the 1470s, and they're discredited. And I think then there's a new... Then I think that the then head of the Wallace family is paying Blind Harry to spin that up, I think. This wonderful spin. Alan Borthwick, are you there, Alan? I'm quoting what you said, a couple of... the depiction of Wallace, you told me this recently, so I'm quoting you, footnoting you. The depiction of Wallace comes straight from a chronicle depiction of Charlemagne, both in Blind Harry and in Bower. Now it's like saying, nowadays, if you want any national hero, any great person, he must look like a film star because he will be in a film. And so we don't know what Wallace is like, but you have Mel Gibson playing him. Then they just wrote him, they just take the standard depiction of a great hero. It's the same kind of image. This is the kind of thing. That's what we get in the Chronicles.
No, he was better looking than Mel Gibson, and he was taller, despite what everybody says. Michael, any comments?
I've no comment on that one.
Right, okay. David, anything? No.
I would endorse everything that I think has been said already.
Right. I'm going to open it up to the audience. You've got a chance to ask questions of our experts. Can you keep it as short as you can so I can get as many people in as we can? If you put your hand up, I'll indicate to you, and there will either be a mic light up near you or you'll get a roving mic behind you. So the gentleman in the check shirt right at the very front.
Don't know if it's working yet. To ask the panel to start right at the very start, what are their thoughts on where Wallace was born? Can they settle it?
Oh dear.
Not Elderslie.
Oh dear. Right, okay. Right, controversy time.
I think that
Sit on the
they
fence.
got it right. And it's probably, we can't prove it, we cannot prove it, Ayrshire, not Elderslie. Elderslie comes out of Blind Harry. Wallace of Craigie was the man that Sandy alluded to who was the main sponsor of Blind Harry's Wallace. The Craigies also owned Elderslie in Renfrewshire, and it would be a bit obvious to say he was William Wallace of Craigie. That would be a bit obvious. So he almost certainly chose Elderslie for that reason. We can't get Elderslie back any further than I think.
Also, the Wallace of Craigie's nephew held Elderslie in the 1470s. Yes. Wallace in Blind Harry is the nephew of Wallace of Craigie.
Ah, right, okay.
And spins it back. You can take Elderslie back, but if the Wallace family, if Wallace's own family, the real Wallace's family held Elderslie in the 1300s, yeah, it's very unlikely to have gone back into the whole things don't quite work.
Don't work. You can't get it back.
And in the argument,
sorry, can I just finish here? The other angle is that, as we know from the other side of the Lubeck letter seal, Wallace's father is Alan Wallace, not a knight as far as we know. The only Alan Wallace, we don't know if this is the man, on the Ragman roll of 1296, when Edward made everyone, well, not everyone, some people submit to him, is a royal tenant in Ayrshire, in Kingskyle in Ayrshire. So we cannot prove that that's the one, but if you're going from Wallace's time forward rather than from our time back, then that's what we're left with. So I think that what was written out there is right, despite what someone phoned up to say.
I've got 4 experts here. Ayrshire or Elderslie?
I'm Ayrshire.
I will accept what these two. These two know what they're talking about, unlike me on this one.
Yeah, so Walter Bower says William Wallace was the son of, and he left a blank for the name. So Blind Harry, a few years later, knows it all. The Wallaces, he could have asked them. They don't know, they make it up. Ayrshire, Auchenbachry, I think that's there's Wallaces there. There's Wallaces in Ayrshire, and it's a branch of them.
2, 1 sitting on the fence.
Evidence is totally inadequate, actually. We really don't know. Father is someone called Alan Wallace. Ayrshire, most likely. But we really don't know.
Small piece of crown land near Ayr is what those tenants, the Alan Wallace is among those ones.
Right, okay.
Near Ayr.
The gentleman up the back
who's from Lanarkshire?
with the blue T-shirt on.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Hello, good afternoon. The Court Try 1302 situation, is there any possibility or any potential linkage with Wallace in a tactical context based on his questionable success against the cavalry at Falkirk, that Courtrai had resemblances of a spearman-based army defeating cavalry? And is it motivated potentially by a betrayal and a reaction from Wallace, who may well have still been in continental Europe at that time, feeling betrayed by the French king, based on the developments you discussed earlier?
Yeah, it's a nice idea that. I think, just to put it in a slightly broader context, that something very interesting is happening in warfare at just this time. That cavalry forces who'd been utterly dominant in the first half, most of the 13th century, suddenly cavalry forces are being defeated by infantry. And Stirling Bridge it's a little bit exceptional, because for the most part, what you get are infantry forces in very, very strong defensive positions, discovering that they can deal with cavalry. Falkirk, of course, disproves that point in a sense, in that the Scots were drawn up in these massed schiltroms, actually tied round with ropes, so the troops really couldn't escape. They were bound together with like a kind of porcupine of spears pointing outwards. And the English managed to break those. But that was exceptional. For the most part, infantry forces are thoroughly effective. Now, would the Flemings have known about this? Yes, they possibly would have done. Were their weapons and methods similar? No, they weren't. The particularly nasty Flemish weapon is a thing called the Godendag, a kind of club with a pointed end. The Flemish would go up to people and say, "Good day, Godendag," and if they didn't get the answer in the proper Flemish language, then that was it. Bashed them on the head. I think Courtrai is different. It's urban levies taking advantage of the ground, establishing themselves in a strong position. It seems to me unlikely that they would have received advice from somebody who must actually, in military terms, have been somewhat discredited. He'd won one battle, but then the main one he'd lost. Why take advice from someone who'd catastrophically lost the Battle of Falkirk? Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go to the gentleman just second from the front with the blue shirt on.
Hello? Can you hear it, aye? Right. Could I ask you two short questions, please? Why has it taken us 700 years to discover the whereabouts of the Paris letter? I personally have searched for this safe conduct letter for many years.
It was known in 1830.
It was found in 1830.
It was found then. Before then, it's in English archives. People don't actually go through government documents until historians want to look at them. There'll be an awful lot of paperwork produced here that nobody's going to look at for a long time, I suspect.
But these documents just were mouldering in the Tower of London. They weren't catalogued, they weren't beautifully kept like they are now. There was just a huge pile. And Mr. Bain went through them and catalogued them, and that's when he found it. Okay.
Second question, Chair. Do you know of the whereabouts of the epistle or Bible belonging to Wallace's mother, which he carried on his person at all times?
What's the evidence for that?
Who tells us about this?
Well, you can quote for Blind Harry if you like.
I'm afraid Blind Harry is, as far as historians are concerned, not a credible source. I'm sorry, he's not.
He's in effect a novelist.
Yeah, he's writing a story.
It's a docudrama.
Yeah. Wallace's mother is not the person that Harry says. Wallace's mother did not go to Dunfermline. All of that, I'm sorry, it's just not true. It's a lovely story, but it's not true.
Thank you very much.
The gentleman just in, yep. Mike, coming to you.
The Philip IV letter. The Vatican archives are reputedly a good source of medieval history on many subjects. Is there any evidence that we know of lobbying by Wallace or by other Scots or by the French on their behalf in the Vatican at that time?
Anybody got any?
Well, there's clearly lots of Scottish diplomatic activity going on in Rome. There's no doubt about that, and there's a lot of evidence for what they were doing. What we don't have is any specific indication that Wallace is involved in that. I mean, he might have been, but that's the missing link, if you like. Now, you're right about the archives of the papacy being normally extremely good for everything, but they have suffered over the course of time as well. Not least, not long after this, the papacy moved to Avignon. The archive trundled north. It stayed in Avignon, and a lot of things kind of went missing because of lack of care during the Avignon period, and so things have got lost. The papal archive, unfortunately, is probably not going to unfold any more secrets, but you never know.
And remember, it's dealing with the whole of Europe.
Yeah.
I mean, they're massive.
I mean, the main kind of evidence we've got, of course, is the things like the papal bull that was what is drawn up in 1299. It was brought to Edward I in Scotland in 1300, setting out, I mean, the Pope was setting out the arguments that the Scots had put to him about Scotland as an independent kingdom, the origins of Scotland, so on and so forth. So we know the arguments that the Scottish diplomats were putting, but we can't link those, of course, with Wallace.
Okay, the gentleman second from the back with his hand up.
Yeah.
We can hear you beautifully.
Fine, thanks. I've got a question to the panel about the significance of William Wallace. William Wallace is often sort of described as a brigand and an adventurer, but really coming from Lanark, which is where the events took place, and have studied the events quite closely, I think he was more rebelling against the imposition of a thing called prest, which was a tax on wool. And I think it is interesting that Lanark, being the centre of the wool industry in southern Scotland, should be the place where he chose to strike a blow against the English occupation. And it's a very wealthy area, having contacts with abroad, because I found pottery from France, from Germany, and also we found in the area a coin from Flanders, indicating that it was a vibrant centre with international links.
Okay, thank you. Comments?
I think that, I mean, you've got to set this in context of what's happening in England when Edward I is sending out officials to seize all the wool in the country. He's effectively nationalising the wool trade. And anyone in Scotland would have been terrified that that same policy was going to be adopted in Scotland. And I think that, I mean, I would agree with you, that's an important part of the background.
But I think we can't say that Lanark is an important centre of the wool, not if you study I mean, all the trade goes from the east, and we're talking the eastern borders. There's no documentary evidence that Lanark and the West are significantly involved with wool. You're going to get sheep all over the place, but the main areas are the upland ones, maybe South Lanarkshire, maybe, but it's more going across in Roxburgh, Selkirk, Dumfries, those parts of the borders. And I think that's the main wool.
That said, when Edward I does try to concentrate Scottish wool exports on Berwick, this does bring in protest from Ayr. So there is clearly it's coming from all over, and there are certainly some West Coast wool exports. But the great bulk of exports is heading through the east, and probably the most valuable ones are those that are belonging to the southern monasteries.
The gentleman three from the back, you put your hand up.
Thank you very much. Just a general question. historical context and folk icon status besides, who do the panel feel is more historically significant in the story of Scotland? Robert the Bruce or William Wallace?
Well, you've had to decide between Ayrshire and Renfrew, so now Bruce or Wallace?
You're talking real historical people rather than... Well, if real historical people, it has to be Robert Bruce. But in terms of... that's not to denigrate Wallace's great contribution. And as an icon, he has... Yeah, whiffle waffle. No, definitely Robert Bruce. I mean, Wallace is a man whose career is from 1296 to 97, depending on when he first raised his head. 1297 to 1303. Bruce arguably nearly destroyed Scotland, but nonetheless, in the end, succeeded well beyond what anyone could have expected. So, on that criteria alone.
Bruce or Wallace?
I would agree with that. I would say certainly in the kind of the immediate short term, Bruce can look to successes, which Wallace, in a sense, has to wait until centuries later in terms of his kind of reputation kind of taking over then.
In a way, you're coming from a Wallace versus Bruce implicit standpoint. And that is there in the spins you get in the Chronicles early. They invent the idea. Chronicles, almost at the time, probably anti-Bruce, pro-coming people, are inventing the idea that Bruce was on the English side at Falkirk, which he wasn't. I'm 99%. Well, I would... No, he's not.
I don't know.
Sorry. We don't know, but... He's opposing... If he was on the English side at Falkirk, they make him Guardian of Scotland almost immediately, very soon afterwards. It doesn't make sense. The point is that Bruce, incidentally, will be just about as nasty a character as Wallace are. They're both... You wouldn't like any of them, really. They're very nasty, tough people. But Bruce is remember, Malcolm Wallace is in Bruce's retinue. John Wallace was killed in 1306 fighting with Bruce. If the Wallace the hero had survived... he would have been very close to... He would have been backing Bruce's campaign for the crown. He would have then had the place in history that the Douglases have. You wouldn't have had Sir James Douglas, because that's the kind of role that Wallace would have had. And he'd have become Major Noble, Great Lord, etc., etc., etc. We like him now because he's an ordinary person. But that's because the English caught him and killed him. If he'd been involved with Bruce, he would have been promoted, no problem.
In a sense, obviously, you wouldn't have had Bruce without Wallace beforehand. But quite simply, the vote has to go to Bruce. Bruce won the Battle of Bannockburn and Wallace lost the Battle of Falkirk. I put it as simply as that. Bruce every time.
The gentleman right in the front.
How much of an influence do you reckon the Douglas deal, if I use the wide name, and the Wallace connection? I'm referring particularly to what you've raised about the about the house. You could say the House of Douglas rising into a major force, particularly where it's located in the borders.
Any comments?
Well, Wallace, of course, immediately after murdering the sheriff at Lanark, is in the company of William Douglas, James Douglas's father, and then they go scooting up to Scone, which is quite a long way. Douglas, of course, is not that far from Lanark. So they go up to Scone, and then William Douglas goes across and joins with the Stuart Bishop of Glasgow and Earl of Carrick and their rebellion in the far west. So there's clearly, in the west of Scotland, a great network of communication, presumably through a lot of the churchmen wandering around. So there is that direct connection. But after that, William Douglas, of course, immediately after that is captured and dies in an English prison. And young James is probably with William Lamberton, his son, the one that becomes, and trying desperately to get his father's lands back, up to the point where he would have definitely sided with the English if Edward I had given him his lands back. But he didn't, so then he joined Bruce, and the rest, as they say, is history. But Douglas is a fascinating story, and I don't know that people know, although Douglas did, as Sandy said, I think, take over the nationalist cause with John Barber's The Bruce. It's as much about Douglas as it is about Bruce. I think we don't actually, generally speaking, in Scotland, know all that much about him, I don't think.
Geoffrey Barrow once said that if you look at the Scots who support the independence cause all the way through, you will never find any of the Scots of Flemish descent not the Norman, but the ones of Flemish descent, they are the ones who are most consistently on the Scottish side. It might be again the wool, it might be the contact, but just it might be a coincidence.
Are you talking about the Douglases?
Douglases, yes, and Murrays, but you won't find any of them on the English.
Weren't consistently on the Scottish side.
Leaving that aside, in Lanarkshire, well, you've got the strong Flemish connections in Lanarkshire, very, very strong. But the major Lanarkshire figures are the Murrays, and one of the Murrays is Andrew Murray. I'll keep on coming back to that. The Murray lands, eventually, that's Bothwell, the great castle of Bothwell and all that. They are coming to the Douglases through marriage in the 14th century. William Douglas is only a relatively minor-ish, a middling baron. He's not great. He's not a great man. He's middle rank. And it's the rewards that James Douglas gets afterwards, outside Lanarkshire actually, that builds him up, and then there's more marriage, the whole thing goes up. Those rewards might have gone to Wallace if you see that's the point I was making. If Wallace is supported. But leaving that aside, the Douglases are later, you see, but there might be a Lanarkshire thing, but perhaps, but we don't know. But the big Douglas thing comes later. It's the rewards from Robert Bruce. And if there's other people there, you might not have rewarded them in the same way. You might not have had the same role. That's the point.
I've got time for a couple of quick questions. The young lady in the red, just behind you, Judith.
At Bishop Briggs Academy, we're big fans of Andrew Murray. If Murray had survived, do you think that William Wallace would be the legend he is today?
If Murray had survived, would
William Wallace be the legend he is today if Murray had survived?
Goodness knows. I mean, my guess would be that if Murray had survived, he would have been the main leader. We would not hear so much about Wallace.
Murray's father, Murray of Petty in the north, a major landowner in the north, but his uncle, and he's the heir to both of them, his uncle doesn't have any children, is Murray of Bothwell, and that is the big estate, and with lots of French contacts, with lots of things. And the Murray's son is Guardian of Scotland in 1330s and won the Battle of Colbleen, which is the way that effectively stops Edward III's conquest of Scotland. But I'm biased, but the point is the Murray line then gets taken over by the Douglases, and in effect, I think the Douglases write the Murrays out of history, because they swallow them up. And there's a huge Douglas bandwagon of propaganda and a Douglas image building up in the late 14th and 15th centuries, and the Murrays everybody else is written out to the Douglas. There's a Douglas steamroller, which then goes, and then Blind Parry comes along and tries to rebuild a Wallace one, almost, you could say.
Okay, I've got time for, I think, one more question, if anybody... No? Yeah. Kickaboo. There we go, the lady in the front.
As a minor noble, how was William Wallace able to raise such an army that he could challenge or hope to challenge that of Edward?
It's a very, very good question. I mean, I think in essence we don't really know, but clearly there is a lot of communication between people and the different rebellions that are going on. This is also a time of rising population. There are almost certainly a lot of younger sons who are potentially a bit like Wallace, slightly on the wrong side of the law, not necessarily, who may not always have had careers and lands and the usual respectable things. That there may have been young men like that who were very ready to join someone like Wallace. Certainly he goes to Selkirk Forest and people go there. Somehow they know to go there and join him. Whether their lords are sending them, they're saying, look, we can't be seen to go because we're being watched, but you could. Or whether or not people are just joining anyway. There's certainly Bishop Wishart, which is very hard to say. Bishop Wishart seems to be very influential and sending out messages throughout the country. So it's a difficult issue to be explicit about, but there are always, of course, mechanisms in Scotland to raise men. Whether those mechanisms are being used on Wallace's behalf, some people will be using them, other people will just be hearing and going, I suspect.
I think it's quite... Sorry, David.
No, I was just going to say a couple of other things. Coercion, maybe. We can't rule that out, as well as charisma. And the other thing, that coming back to what I said at the beginning, so if somebody respects the kind of the agricultural cycle of the year and isn't trying to haul people into an army when they're wanting to be harvesting the crops in the fields, respect for the kind of what's important on a day-to-day life, that surely is probably going to encourage people as well, rather than put them off.
The Lubeck letter is Murray and Wallace, leaders of the Army of Scotland. we don't know when they invent that term. I mean, leader of the army, if the bishop, if they can get the civil service on side, and there's a lot of tacit half support sitting on the fence from the major people. If you can get the bureaucracy on side, and Andrew Murray certainly could, his father was a justiciar, but I suspect they can do that, then you can just send out the documents and use the normal call-up things, and you hope that people will come, and some will. And the thing will escalate, but there's a bureaucracy behind it. Whereas 13.3...
But that's after Stirling Bridge.
No, but
the question is what they're doing before.
Yes, well, we don't know, but we do not know that they weren't calling themselves that earlier. They might have been, or there might have been some concept like that, and they're using... There's a call-up mechanism, which is quite straightforward. You just tell people, it happens, it doesn't need too much bureaucracy. Later, after 13.3, Wallace can't do it. He has got very few men with him at the end. Almost in a way, the bureaucracy abandons Wallace once the Scots submit formally in 13.3.4. He can't get a call up then in a way he could in 1297, I think.
I think there's an interesting question as to whether we're dealing, in a sense, with almost a popular rebellion, that the Scottish aristocracy had, in a sense, failed in 1296 when Edward I had simply walked through Scotland without facing really any significant opposition. And whether, in fact, the time is right for someone who is not aristocratic to come forward and be accepted as a leader, that there was something really quite strange going on that would produce someone of that kind. That it's only in a period of real crisis, I think, that you would get someone coming forward who is not the kind of aristocratic leader that you would expect. But having said that, of course, Wallace does not then behave like the leader of a peasant rebellion.
Mm-hmm. Can I just add, I've just remembered that Macduff of Fife was known to be with Wallace. Macduff is probably a younger son of the Earl, and almost certainly the one in charge in terms of the native families, the more Gaelic, the Celtic system, of raising the men of Fife. So he was performing a traditional role and had joined Wallace.
But there may well have been a lot of local revolts which are just coming together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I used to work, in the 1970s, I worked in Queen's Belfast. If you want documentary evidence of how the IRA mobilised themselves, it's quite difficult to find. How did the Taliban organise themselves? In a way, these things happen. And it's, without making any comparison, a popular revolt can happen and it can get itself together. Peasant revolt, 1381. They just send people around the village, and they almost do a semi-military call-up for that. And they get thousands of men with arrows, with bows and arrows, actually, to march on London. That's very scary. But you can do that. It's not so difficult in medieval society. There's more unofficial, just informal bureaucracies will do that.
Thank you, and thank you all very much for contributing, to which I think was a fascinating discussion. Will you join me in thanking Professor-Michael-Prestwich, Dr. Alexander Grant, Dr. David Ditchburn, and Fiona-Watson for their contribution today. Thank you very much.